After nearly 2 years of preparations, Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia and attended the first China-Arab Summit and the China Gulf Cooperation Council Summit. In contrast to the muted reception Joe Biden received when visiting Saudi Arabia in the summer, Xi Jinping was given a lavish welcome, including an escort by 4 fighter jets from the Royal Saudi Air Force after Xi's plane entered Saudi Arabia's airspace. 7 Saudi jets painted the sky in the colors of China's national flag. But despite the ceremonial satisfaction, Xi didn't quite get what he wanted from the trip, and China's state media may have shed some light on that. Hi everyone, welcome to Leisrealtalk. I'm Lei. Since the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the CCP has been actively engaging Arab nations. 13 Arab countries voted in favor of China getting a seat in the United Nations in 1971. By 1990, Beijing had established diplomatic relations with all Arab countries. This reduced Taiwan's diplomatic space and has quietly built up the CCP's influence in the region. China is now the #1 trading partner and largest foreign investor in Arab countries. In 2021, 51% of China's crude oil imports came from Arab countries. Sino-Arab trade during the first 3 quarters of 2022 increased by 35% over the last year. In addition, 20 Middle Eastern countries have signed Belt and Road agreements, and Beijing has established comprehensive strategic partnerships with Egypt, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The center of Beijing's efforts in the region is the Persian Gulf, namely the 6 member countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. China-GCC trade represents 70% of total Sino-Arab trade. China's 2021 crude oil imports from the GCC countries accounted for 3/4 of the total oil imports from Arab countries. Xi Jinping's trip to the Middle East was his 3rd diplomatic endeavor after the November Party Congress. The Saudi press and other foreign media widely reported the 34 investment agreements Xi signed. On December 10th, the day he returned to Beijing, Xinhua News gave a rather brief concluding commentary, which contrasted from its elaborate coverage during the early part of Xi's trip. The news report did not mention the 34 investment agreements. They would have been a major accomplishment for Xi, but why didn't Xinhua even mention them? The only explanation is that the terms of the agreements are not favorable to China. If reported, they would make Xi Jinping lose face in front of his domestic audience. The only thing mentioned on the day Xi Jinping returned to Beijing was the agreement Sinopec signed with Saudi Aramco to build an integrated oil refining facility as part of the Phase 2 Fujian Gulai project. But the terms and amount were not disclosed by Xinhua either. Xi's trip may be fruitful for the Saudis but not for Beijing for a number of reasons. First, Beijing's usual tactics when dealing with other nations, that is, using the Chinese market and investments as incentives, don't work with the Saudis. China has a large trade deficit with Saudi Arabia. In 2021, it exported $30 billion worth of goods to Saudi Arabia, while imports were $57 billion. Chinese need Saudi oil, but the Saudis don't have a big demand for cheap made-in-China products. Saudi Arabia is a wealthy country with a population of 35 million, which favors European and American brands over Chinese brands. And the oil-rich country doesn't need Chinese investment capital. In his speech at the China-GCC summit, Xi Jinping proposed the settlement of oil and gas trade in Chinese currency, renminbi. This was one of the goals of Xi's visit and has attracted much attention. But Saudi Arabia's trade surplus with China would make it difficult to agree to a full renminbi settlement. Saudi Arabia doesn't buy enough Chinese products to pay with the renminbi it would get from oil sales, so it may agree to renminbi settlement for a small amount of oil sales. But in the Xinhua published joint statement of the summit, there's no mention of a renminbi settlement. Saudi Arabia and the GCC member states seem reluctant to agree to a renminbi settlement. At the subsequent China-Arab summit, attended by more Arab heads of state, Xi Jinping gave another speech, but this time without mentioning the renminbi settlement. In fact, in the current geopolitical tensions, it would be difficult for the Saudis to accept a renminbi settlement without worrying about further alienating the United States. If the CCP attacks Taiwan, the United States and the West will impose an oil embargo on China. The oil tankers from Saudi Arabia would not be able to cross the Indian Ocean. The passage of oil from Saudi Arabia to Japan and South Korea will also be in trouble, and the Saudis will have to rely on the United States to ensure the security of its oil exports. Beijing has been trying to open up the Saudi arms market, but Saudi Arabia has little interest in Beijing's low-quality weaponry supported by Russian military technology. Saving money isn't the Saudis' priority, but they are interested in Chinese missile and drone technology. In 2017, Saudi Arabia ordered Chinese-made Winglong 2 drones. Xinhua described the deal as the country's largest ever arms export. In March 2022, Chinese and Saudi companies created a joint venture to make military drones in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has limited room for military cooperation with Beijing, as the kingdom cannot afford to lose the protection of the United States military. Saudi Arabia is a major importer of U.S. arms. For example, the backbone of Saudi's Air Force is the American-made F-15 fighter jets. The Saudi jets that escorted Xi Jinping's plane were the American F-15s. People's Daily proclaimed that these escort jets gave Xi Jinping the highest courtesy welcome. I think it's somewhat ironic that the Saudis used American-made fighter jets to welcome Xi. No wonder China's Central TV blurred the images of the jets in its news report. Another issue that makes Xi lose face is the CCP's role in regional conflicts. Beijing has supported Iran and built relations with Israel. A September 9th report in the South China Morning Post said that Beijing and Israel would sign a free trade agreement by the end of this year. This will be China's first free trade agreement in the Middle East. And on January 14th this year, China and Iran announced the launch of a 25-year, $400 billion comprehensive cooperation agreement. Saudis are aware of China's relations with Iran. Iranian-backed terrorist groups have attacked Saudi oil facilities with drones. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia share the same goal when it comes to dealing with Iran. The CCP's approach to the Iranian nuclear issue is highly detrimental to Saudi Arabia's security. So the Saudis decided to give Xi Jinping and the CCP some pressure at the summit. The CCP often claims that it doesn't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries and doesn't take a stand on regional conflicts, at least nominally. But this time, Beijing has taken the unprecedented step of getting involved in Middle Eastern conflicts. In a rare move, the Sino-Saudi joint statement mentioned several countries and issues. China appreciates the Saudi initiative aimed at ending the war in Yemen and stresses that the Houthis should observe the ceasefire and cooperate with the UN Special Envoy for Yemen. The two sides called on Iran to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency to preserve the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The CCP statement at the China-GCC summit also said it calls on Iraq to respect Kuwait's sovereignty and territorial integrity. At the Sino-Arab summit, China declared in a statement that Israeli settlements in Palestine as well as in the occupied Arab territories are illegal, and Israeli unilateral initiatives aimed at changing the status quo in Jerusalem initiatives are null and void. At the two summits, Arab countries forced Beijing to take a stand on regional issues. Xi Jinping had no choice but to comply in exchange for upgrading relations with the Saudis to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Arab countries' focus on terrorism at the GCC summit can also make Xi lose face. The leaders of the 6 Gulf states specifically discussed terrorism with Xi Jinping, which may hint at the unsavory role the CCP has played. The joint statement published by Xinhua included the following article. Article 8. The leaders discussed regional and international issues and agreed to maintain an international order based on respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all countries, not to use force or threaten to use force. Did the 6 heads of state from the Gulf countries have Taiwan in mind when talking to Xi Jinping about terrorism? Was it their way to force Xi to commit to not using force against Taiwan? I think Xi Jinping's visit did not achieve much substantive results for the CCP. Chinese state media focused on the ceremonial pageantry of the visit, but stayed low-key on the substance of the summits. I think the Saudis and the Arab nations got what they wanted from the meetings, but Xi Jinping did not. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. That's all for today. Thank you. See you next time.